The sound of gunfire echoed through the dusty streets of Miles City, Montana Territory, as Abe Calloway rode in, his face a mask of indifference beneath the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. Blood trickled down his arm from a graze wound that stung like hellfire, but he'd known worse pain, the kind that didn't heal with time and whiskey. The year was 1878, and Abe had long since stopped counting the men he'd killed or the miles he'd traveled trying to outrun his own demons. The main street was mostly deserted as dusk approached, with only a few brave souls peering from behind curtained windows. Abe dismounted his exhausted chestnut mare in front of the weathered sign of the Frontier Saloon, tethering her to the post with practiced hands that never seemed to shake, even after the shootout he'd barely escaped 20 miles back. "Another town, another chance to disappoint," he muttered to himself as he pushed through the swinging doors, the familiar stench of cheap liquor and unwashed bodies greeting him like an old friend. Inside, a handful of men hunched over their glasses, momentarily glancing up at the newcomer before returning to their drinks. Abe made his way to the bar, his spurs jingling with each heavy step. "Whiskey," he said, his voice rough from days of riding through the Montana dust. The barkeep, a round man with a greasy apron, nodded and poured a generous glass. "You look like you've seen some trouble, mister," the barkeep observed, eyeing the blood-stained sleeve of Abe's duster. Abe downed the whiskey in one gulp, letting the burn chase away the chill that had settled in his bones. "Ain't we all?" he replied, sliding the empty glass forward for a refill. As the barkeep poured another shot, the door to the saloon swung open again, and this time the patron's attention stayed fixed on the entrance. Abe turned, his hand instinctively moving to the revolver at his hip. But what stood in the doorway wasn't a threat, at least not the kind he was accustomed to. A woman stepped inside, her presence immediately commanding the room. She wore a practical, albeit worn, riding dress, and her auburn hair was partially tucked beneath a small hat. What caught Abe's attention, though, were her eyes, fierce and determined, yet holding a warmth that seemed out of place in a town as rough as Miles City. "I'm looking for Sheriff Davies," she announced, her voice clear and steady. "I was told I could find him here." The barkeep shook his head. "Sheriff's out tracking a gang that hit the bank in Billings. Won't be back for days, miss." The woman's shoulders slumped slightly, but her resolve didn't waver. "Then I'll wait for his return. In the meantime, I need a room at the boarding house and information about a man named Lucas Blackwell." At the mention of that name, several men shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Abe remained still, watching the woman with newfound interest. Blackwell was notorious throughout the territory, a land baron with a reputation for acquiring property through means that skirted the edges of legality when they didn't cross them outright. "Might be best to leave that matter alone, miss," the barkeep suggested quietly. "Blackwell ain't someone folks around here talk about freely." "I didn't come all the way from St. Louis to be turned away by fearful whispers," she replied firmly. "My name is Violet James, and I have business with Mr. Blackwell that cannot wait." Abe couldn't help but let out a dry chuckle. The woman Violet turned her attention to him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Something amusing, sir?" she asked, a challenge in her voice. "Just thinking that either you're the bravest woman I've met or the most foolish," Abe replied, tipping his hat. "Blackwell doesn't take kindly to business he hasn't initiated himself." Violet approached the bar, positioning herself a few stools away from Abe. "And you know this from personal experience, Mr. Calloway, Abe Calloway." He finished his second whiskey. "And let's just say I've seen what happens to folks who cross Blackwell's path uninvited." Something flashed in Violet's eyes, grief, perhaps, or anger before she masked it. "Well, Mr. Calloway, I appreciate your concern, but my business with Blackwell is my own." The barkeep placed a glass of water in front of Violet without being asked. "Miss James, the boarding house is 3 doors down. Mrs. Hawkins runs a clean place. As for Blackwell, his ranch is about 10 miles north of town, but I wouldn't recommend going alone." "Thank you," Violet said, taking a small sip of the water. "I'll keep that in mind." Abe watched as she finished her water, placed a coin on the counter, and prepared to leave. As she turned toward the door, he noticed a small locket hanging from her neck, catching the dim lamplight. Something about her determination, or perhaps it was the foolishness of her mission, made him speak up. "Miss James," he called, causing her to pause at the door. "If you're set on meeting Blackwell, you might want someone who knows the territory. These parts ain't kind to strangers, especially after sundown." Violet studied him for a long moment, taking in his dusty appearance, the blood on his sleeve, and the hardness in his eyes. "Are you offering your services, Mr. Calloway?" Abe wasn't sure why he'd spoken up. He'd ridden into Miles City planning to lay low for a few days, maybe take on some work at one of the ranches before moving on. Getting involved with whatever business this woman had with Blackwell was asking for trouble. "I'm offering advice," he finally said. "Wait for the sheriff." Violet's lips curled into a small, determined smile. "Thank you, Mr. Calloway, but I've waited long enough." With that, she pushed through the doors and disappeared into the growing darkness. The barkeep shook his head as he wiped down the counter. "That's a woman with a mission. Shame if Blackwell's men get to her before she even reaches the ranch." Abe stared at the door for a moment longer, then downed his third whiskey. "Not my problem," he muttered, though the words felt hollow even to his own ears. He paid for his drinks and a room upstairs, intent on cleaning his wound and getting some rest. But as he climbed the creaking stairs, his thoughts kept returning to Violet James and the determination in her eyes. Whatever business she had with Blackwell, it was personal, and in Abe's experience, personal business with men like Blackwell rarely ended well. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, the kind of autumn day that reminded Abe that winter wasn't far off. He'd need to find somewhere to hunker down soon if he planned to survive the Montana winter. His arm throbbed dully as he made his way downstairs, the crude stitches he'd put in the night before holding the wound closed. The saloon was quiet this early, with only a couple of early risers nursing coffees at the far table. Abe ordered breakfast and sat by the window, watching the town come to life. His attention was caught by the sight of Violet James emerging from the boarding house, dressed for riding with a determined set to her shoulders. "Damn fool woman," he muttered, watching as she headed toward the livery stable. He finished his breakfast quickly and made his way outside, telling himself he was just going to check on his horse. The livery stable was at the end of the main street, and by the time Abe reached it, Violet was already saddling a sturdy-looking bay mare. "Planning a morning ride, Miss James?" he asked, leaning against the stable door. Violet didn't look up from her work. "I thought I made my intentions clear last night, Mr. Calloway." "You did," Abe acknowledged. "I just figured a night's rest might have brought some sense to your plans." Now she did look at him, her green eyes flashing with irritation. "My sense is just fine. It's my patience that's wearing thin." Abe stepped closer, noting the determined way she tightened the saddle girth. She clearly knew her way around horses, which was something, at least. "Blackwell's ranch is surrounded by men who shoot first and don't bother asking questions after," he said quietly. "Whatever business you have with him, it ain't worth dying over." Violet paused, her hands stilling on the leather straps. For a moment, her composure cracked, revealing something raw and painful underneath. "My brother might disagree with you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He came to settle land he legally purchased near Blackwell's property. 3 weeks later, I received a letter saying he died in an accident, but Thomas was too careful for accidents, Mr. Calloway." Abe's jaw tightened. He'd heard similar stories before, too many to count. Blackwell's empire had been built on broken backs and stolen futures. "I'm sorry about your brother," he said genuinely. "But getting yourself killed won't bring him justice." "I'm not seeking justice," Violet replied, her composure returning as she finished with the saddle. "I'm seeking the truth, and the deed to my brother's land, which is legally mine now." Abe let out a low whistle. "Land, now I understand. Blackwell doesn't give up an inch of territory, whether it's rightfully his or not." "This land is mine by law," Violet insisted. "I have the papers to prove it." "Papers don't mean much out here," Abe said, gesturing vaguely to the wild country beyond the town. "But blood does. Blackwell understands that language well enough." Violet led her horse out of the stall, pausing in front of Abe. "I don't need lectures on frontier justice, Mr. Calloway. I need directions to Blackwell's ranch." Abe studied her face, seeing the same determination he'd noticed the night before. But in the morning light, he could also see the faint shadows under her eyes and the tension in her shoulders. She was afraid, but pushing forward anyway. It was foolish, reckless even, and yet, Abe found himself reluctantly admiring her courage. "North out of town, follow the creek until you hit a split in the road," he finally said. "Take the left fork. You'll see his gates about 3 miles up. Can't miss him. Got his name worked into the iron." Violet nodded, seemingly surprised by his cooperation. "Thank you." As she prepared to mount her horse, Abe made a decision he knew he'd likely regret. "I'll go with you." She froze, one foot in the stirrup. "Excuse me." "You're going whether I help or not," Abe reasoned, more to himself than to her. "Might as well have someone watching your back." Violet regarded him suspiciously. "Why would you do that? You don't know me." "I know Blackwell," Abe replied grimly. "And I know what happens to people who go up against him alone." For a long moment, Violet said nothing, clearly weighing her options. Finally, she nodded. "Very well, Mr. Calloway, but I'll be paying you for your time." "Don't need your money," Abe said, already moving to saddle his own horse. "Just try not to get us both killed." Within half an hour, they were riding north out of Miles City, the morning sun warming their backs as they followed the meandering creek that would lead them to Blackwell's ranch. Abe rode slightly ahead, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon and the surrounding brush. Blackwell was known to have men patrolling his boundaries, and they weren't the type to ask questions before drawing their weapons. "How long have you known Blackwell?" Violet asked after they'd been riding in silence for some time. Abe kept his eyes on the trail. "Never said I knew him, said I know of him, different thing entirely." "But you've had dealings with him, you could say that," Abe replied evasively. The truth was more complicated and more dangerous than he cared to admit to this woman he barely knew. Violet seemed to sense his reluctance. "My brother wrote to me about him before the accident, said Blackwell had a reputation for expanding his holdings by any means necessary." "Your brother wasn't wrong," Abe confirmed. "Blackwell came to these parts about 10 years ago with nothing but a wagon and a dream of empire. Now he controls half the water rights in the county and more grazing land than any 5 ranchers combined. And the law allows this." Violet asked, her tone incredulous. Abe laughed bitterly. "Law out here is whatever the man with the most guns says it is. Sheriff tries his best, but he's one man against Blackwell's small army." They rode in silence for a while longer, the only sounds the steady rhythm of hooves on the packed dirt and the occasional call of a hawk overhead. When they reached the fork in the road, Abe pulled his horse to a stop. "Last chance to turn back," he offered, nodding toward the right fork. "That way leads to Helena. You could take a stage back east, forget about this whole business." Violet's grip tightened on her reins. "My brother is dead, Mr. Calloway. I don't have the luxury of forgetting." Abe nodded, not surprised by her answer. "Then we go left." As they continued their journey, the landscape began to change. The wild, untamed prairie gave way to neatly fenced pastures where cattle grazed under the watchful eyes of mounted cowboys. These weren't ordinary ranch hands. Abe noted they were armed like soldiers preparing for war. "Blackwell's men," he explained in a low voice. "They'll have spotted us by now." Sure enough, as they approached the ornate iron gates Abe had described with Blackwell woven into the metalwork in elaborate script, 3 riders approached from the main house, which loomed large in the distance. "Stay calm," Abe advised as the men drew nearer. "Let me do the talking." The lead rider, a hard-faced man with a scar running from his eye to his chin, raised his hand to halt them. "This is private property," he announced, his hand resting casually on the revolver at his hip. "We're here to see Mr. Blackwell," Abe replied evenly. "The lady has business with him regarding her late brother's land." The scarred man's eyes narrowed as he studied Violet. "And what's your business here, Calloway? Thought you knew better than to show your face around these parts." Abe kept his expression neutral, though he felt Violet's questioning glance. "Just escorting the lady safely, no trouble," the man snorted disbelievingly. Mr. Blackwell, don't take unannounced visitors. Turn around and go back to town. My name is Violet James, Violet interjected, her voice clear and steady despite the tension. My brother was Thomas James. He owned the parcel of land adjoining the northeast corner of this property. I've come to discuss his affairs with Mr. Blackwell. At the mention of Thomas James, the three men exchanged glances. The scarred man's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Wait here, he finally said, turning his horse toward the main house. The other two men remained, their hands never straying far from their weapons. Abe and Violet sat in tense silence for what felt like an eternity. Finally, the scarred man returned, his expression unreadable. Mr. Blackwell will see you, he announced. Just the lady, you stay put, Calloway. Abe shook his head. That wasn't the arrangement. It's all right, Violet said, surprising him. She leaned closer, speaking quietly. I need to do this. If I'm not back in an hour, then you can worry. Before Abe could argue further, she urged her horse forward, following the scarred man through the gates toward the imposing ranch house. The two remaining men moved their horses to block Abe's path, making it clear he wasn't to follow. Been a long time since you crossed that threshold, one of them commented, a man Abe vaguely recognized from his past encounters with Blackwell's outfit. Figured you were smarter than to come back. Just doing a job, Abe replied tightly, his eyes never leaving Violet's retreating form. The man laughed. Sure you are, and it's got nothing to do with whatever score you still got to settle with the boss. Abe said nothing, but his hand inched closer to his revolver. If anything happened to Violet in that house, these men would be the first to pay for it. The thought surprised him when had her safety become his concern beyond the job at hand. The main house of the Blackwell Ranch was an impressive structure, built with timber hauled from the mountains and stone quarried from the nearby hills. It stood as a monument to Lucas Blackwell's vision of himself as a man of significance, a man of permanence in this wild territory. Violet dismounted at the base of the broad front steps where the scarred man waited for her. Mr. Blackwell is in his study, he said, gesturing toward the ornately carved front door. I'll take you to him. She followed him into a grand entrance hall, its walls adorned with mounted animal heads and expensive paintings that seemed at odds with the frontier setting. The scarred man led her down a hallway to a heavy oak door, which he rapped on sharply before opening. Miss James, sir, he announced, then stepped aside to let Violet enter. The study was a large room lined with bookshelves, though Violet suspected many of the leather-bound volumes had never been opened. Behind a massive desk sat Lucas Blackwell himself, a man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair, and the weathered face of someone who had spent decades in the harsh Montana elements. But it was his eyes that caught Violet's attention, cold and calculating, assessing her worth and threat in a single glance. Miss James, he greeted, not rising from his chair. I understand you believe we have business to discuss. Violet stood straight, refusing to be intimidated by his deliberate lack of courtesy. Mr. Blackwell, thank you for seeing me. I've come regarding my brother's property. Blackwell's expression remained impassive. Ah yes, Thomas James, a tragedy, his accident, my condolences. Was it an accident? Violet asked directly, meeting his gaze unflinchingly. A flicker of something surprise, perhaps, or amusement crossed Blackwell's face. The sheriff certainly thought so. Young man got caught in a flash flood while crossing Bitter Creek. Happens out here, especially to Easterners who don't know the land. My brother grew up on a farm in Missouri, Violet countered. He knew better than to cross swollen creeks. Blackwell spread his hands. Nature can surprise even the most experienced men, Miss James. But I don't believe you came all this way to dispute the manner of your brother's passing. No, Violet agreed, reaching into her satchel to produce a folded document. I came for this, the deed to my brother's land, which now belongs to me as his only living relative. She placed the document on the desk. Blackwell made no move to touch it. Interesting, he said after a moment. Because I have a bill of sale signed by your brother transferring ownership of that land to me just days before his unfortunate accident. Violet's heart sank, but she kept her composure. I'd like to see this bill of sale. Blackwell smiled thinly and opened a drawer, withdrawing a document which he placed beside Violet's deed. Everything in order, as you can see. Your brother was quite eager to sell, actually. Said the land wasn't what he expected. Violet examined the document carefully. The signature did look like Thomas's, but something felt wrong. Her brother had been so excited about his new start in Montana, his letters had been full of plans for the future. "This doesn't make sense," she said finally. "Thomas wrote to me just a week before he died. He never mentioned selling his land. In fact, he talked about the crops he planned to plant come spring." "People change their minds, Miss James," Blackwell replied smoothly. "Particularly when they realize the hardships of frontier life. Your brother made a wise decision to sell when he did." "For a fraction of what he paid," Violet noted, looking at the sale price. "That seems convenient for you." Blackwell's smile disappeared. "I'm a businessman, Miss James. I pay what the market will bear. Now, if there's nothing else, I have matters to attend to." Violet remained standing. "There is something else. I'd like to see where my brother is buried." This request seemed to catch Blackwell off guard. After a moment's hesitation, he nodded. "Of course." "A reasonable request. Simmons will show you to the small cemetery beyond the orchard. We buried your brother there after recovering his body from the creek." "Thank you," Violet said, though the words tasted bitter in her mouth. She didn't believe Blackwell's story about the bill of sale, but she had no way to prove it was falsified. Blackwell rose from his desk, signaling the end of their meeting. "I truly am sorry for your loss, Miss James. The frontier can be an unforgiving place for those unprepared for its challenges. I suggest you return east where life is, safer." The threat underlying his words was unmistakable. Violet nodded stiffly and turned to leave, gathering her deed but leaving the supposed bill of sale on the desk. "Miss James," Blackwell called as she reached the door. "Your companion, Calloway. He's not someone whose company I would recommend. He has a complicated history in these parts." Violet paused, her hand on the doorknob. "Thank you for your concern, Mr. Blackwell, but I'm quite capable of choosing my own associates." Outside, the scarred man Simmons, she presumed, was waiting to escort her to the cemetery. As they walked through the well-tended grounds of the ranch, Violet's mind raced. Blackwell was lying, she was certain of it, but proving it would be another matter entirely. The cemetery was small, with only a handful of markers. Simmons led her to a fresh grave with a simple wooden cross bearing her brother's name. "I'll give you a moment," he said, stepping back to a respectful distance. Violet knelt beside the grave, her throat tight with grief and anger. "I'll find out what happened to you," she whispered to the freshly turned earth. "I promise, Thomas." As she rose to leave, something caught her eye, a small object partially buried at the edge of the grave. Carefully, she reached down and extracted it, concealing the motion from Simmons. It was a button, brass, with an unusual design that Violet recognized immediately. It was from Thomas's favorite coat, the one he'd had made specially before leaving for Montana. She slipped the button into her pocket, her heart pounding. Why would this button be here if Thomas had died in a flash flood miles away? Unless his body had been brought here directly, not recovered from any creek. The ride back to the main house was silent, Violet's mind working furiously to make sense of what she'd discovered. When they reached the front of the house, she was surprised to see Abe still waiting where she'd left him, though the tension in his posture suggested the wait hadn't been pleasant. "Everything all right, Miss James?" he asked as she mounted her horse, his eyes searching her face for signs of trouble. "Yes, thank you, Mr. Calloway," she replied, aware of the watching men. Mr. Blackwell was most informative. They rode away from the ranch in silence, the guards watching them until they passed through the gates and back onto the main road. Only when they were well out of earshot did Abe speak. "What happened in there?" Violet glanced around to ensure they weren't being followed before answering. "Blackwell claims Thomas sold him the land before he died. He showed me a bill of sale with what looked like my brother's signature." Abe's expression darkened. "And you believe that?" "Not for a moment," Violet replied, reaching into her pocket to show him the button. "I found this by his grave. It's from a coat he always wore." But if he died in a flood, as Blackwell claims, how did this button end up by his grave? Abe took the button, examining it closely before handing it back. Suggests he died on Blackwell's property, not in any creek. Exactly, Violet said, her voice tight with controlled anger. Blackwell is lying about how Thomas died, which means he's likely lying about the land sale too. They rode in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Abe spoke again, his voice unusually gentle. What will you do now? Blackwell won't give up that land without a fight, and the law around here. He trailed off. Is whatever the man with the most guns says it is, Violet finished, remembering his words from earlier. I don't know what I'll do yet. But I won't leave until I find out what really happened to my brother. Abe nodded, seemingly unsurprised by her determination. We should get back to town before dark. These roads ain't safe after sunset. They increased their pace, but Violet noticed Abe constantly checking the trail behind them. Do you think Blackwell's men will follow us? She asked. Maybe, Abe replied grimly. Blackwell doesn't like loose ends, and you're asking questions he doesn't want answered. The sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon when they reached the outskirts of Miles City. As they rode down the main street, Violet noticed a commotion outside the sheriff's office. A group of men were gathered around a rider who appeared to have just arrived. Sheriff's back, Abe observed, nodding toward the crowd. Might be worth talking to him about your brother, though I wouldn't expect much help. Violet hesitated. I think I'll wait until morning. I need time to think about what I learned today. They stopped in front of the boarding house, and Abe dismounted to help Violet down from her horse. As her feet touched the ground, their eyes met, and for a moment, something unspoken passed between them. Thank you for accompanying me today, Mr. Calloway, Violet said, suddenly aware of how close they were standing. Abe stepped back, tipping his hat. Just doing what any decent man would do. I suspect decent men are in short supply in these parts, Violet replied with a small smile. Will I see you tomorrow? I could use your guidance when I speak to the sheriff. Abe hesitated, and Violet sensed his reluctance. Whatever his complicated history was with Blackwell, it clearly extended to the local law as well. I'll be around, he finally said. Get some rest, Miss James. Tomorrow's likely to be another long day. As Abe led both horses toward the livery stable, Violet watched him go, her thoughts conflicted. He was a puzzle, hard and unyielding on the surface, yet there was something in his eyes that spoke of deep wounds and perhaps deeper regrets. She wondered what had brought him to Miles City, and what history he shared with Blackwell that made the rancher's men so wary of him. Inside the boarding house, Mrs. Hawkins greeted her with concerned eyes. You're back safe, thank the Lord. When I heard you'd gone out to Blackwell's place, I feared the worst. I'm fine, Mrs. Hawkins, Violet assured her, just tired from the ride. There's stew on the stove if you're hungry, the older woman offered, and fresh bread too. Violet thanked her and went upstairs to wash the dust from her face and hands before dinner. As she stood before the small mirror in her room, she took out Thomas's button again, running her thumb over its surface. Something had happened to her brother on Blackwell's land, something the powerful rancher wanted to keep hidden. After a simple but hearty dinner, Violet retired to her room, spreading out the few documents she had brought with her on the bed. There was Thomas's deed, several letters he had written to her describing his new property and plans, and a crude map he had drawn showing the boundaries of his land in relation to Blackwell's ranch. She studied the map carefully, noting that Thomas's property included access to a stream that flowed from the mountains through Blackwell's ranch. Water rights were precious in this territory. Could that be why Blackwell wanted the land so badly? A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. She gathered the papers quickly before opening it to find Mrs. Hawkins holding a cup of tea. Thought you might like something to help you sleep, dear, the landlady said kindly. Riding can leave one awful sore if you're not used to it. Thank you, Violet said, accepting the cup gratefully. Mrs. Hawkins, did you ever meet my brother, Thomas James? The older woman's expression softened. I did indeed. He stayed here when he first arrived in Miles City before heading out to his property. Such a kind young man, full of dreams. We were all shocked to hear of his accident. Did it seem strange to you? Violet asked carefully. Him drowning, I mean. Mrs. Hawkins glanced down the hallway before stepping into Violet's room and closing the door partway. Between us, she said in a low voice, yes, your brother was careful, sensible, not the type to take foolish risks. And there was something else that never sat right with me. What was that? Violet asked, her heart quickening. The day before they found him, he came into town to buy supplies. He seemed troubled, said he'd discovered something on his land that changed everything. Wouldn't say what, just that he needed to document it before confronting Blackwell. Violet's hands tightened around the teacup. He was going to confront Blackwell about what? Mrs. Hawkins shook her head. He didn't say and I didn't press, but the next day they found him in the creek. She paused, her expression grave. There was talk, though most folk won't say it aloud, that the water in that creek wasn't nearly high enough for a grown man to drown in, accident or no. You think he was murdered, Violet said softly, the words hanging heavy in the air between them. I think, Mrs. Hawkins replied carefully, that Lucas Blackwell is a man who gets what he wants, and your brother had something he wanted. After Mrs. Hawkins left, Violet found sleep elusive. Her mind kept returning to the landlady's words and the button she'd found by Thomas's grave. What had her brother discovered on his land that was worth killing for? Dawn was just breaking when Violet finally drifted into a fitful sleep, only to be awakened shortly after by a commotion in the street below. She rose quickly, dressing and moving to the window to see what was happening. A crowd had gathered outside the sheriff's office, the mood tense and urgent. Violet hurried downstairs, finding Mrs. Hawkins at the front door, her face pale. What's happening? Violet asked. Riders came in from the North Road, Mrs. Hawkins explained. Found a man shot dead about 5 miles out. They're saying it's one of Blackwell's men. Violet's blood ran cold. When? Sometime in the night, they reckon. Sheriff's organizing a posse to investigate. Violet pushed past Mrs. Hawkins and out into the street, making her way toward the gathering crowd. She spotted Abe on the edge of the throng, his expression grim as he listened to the sheriff addressing the assembled townspeople. We'll find who did this, the sheriff was saying, a stout man with a graying mustache and tired eyes. Killing is killing, no matter who the victim worked for. I need volunteers to ride with me out to the scene. Several men stepped forward, some eagerly, others with more reluctance. Abe remained where he was, watching the proceedings with wary eyes. Violet moved to his side. What happened? Blackwell's foreman Simmons was found with a bullet in his back about halfway between town and the ranch, Abe replied quietly. Sheriff's assuming robbery, but what? Violet pressed. Abe's eyes met hers. Simmons was the man who escorted you to your brother's grave yesterday. Now he's dead. That's a coincidence worth noting. The implication was clear. Simmons might have been killed to silence him about something related to Thomas's death. But who would have done it? And why now, as the posse prepared to ride out, the sheriff noticed Violet and Abe standing together? He approached them, his gaze lingering on Abe with obvious suspicion. Calloway, he greeted coldly, thought you'd moved on from these parts. Just passing through, Sheriff Davies, Abe replied evenly. The sheriff turned his attention to Violet. You must be Thomas James's sister. Mrs. Hawkins mentioned you'd arrived. Sorry about your brother. Thank you, Sheriff, Violet said. Actually, I was hoping to speak with you about his death. There are some aspects of the official account that don't quite add up. Sheriff Davies's expression became guarded. I'd be happy to discuss it with you, Miss James, but it'll have to wait until I've dealt with this current situation. He glanced at Abe again. Where were you last night, Calloway? Asleep in my room above the saloon, Abe answered without hesitation. Barkeep can confirm I was there from sundown to sunrise. The sheriff looked unconvinced but didn't press the matter. I'll want to talk to you both when I get back, he said before returning to the posse. As they watched the group ride out of town, Violet turned to Abe. The sheriff doesn't seem to like you much. Feelings mutual, Abe replied tersely. Davies has been in Blackwell's pocket since he first pinned on that badge. Don't expect much help from him regarding your brother. Violet's heart sank. If the law was compromised, where could she turn for justice? What do we do now? Abe considered for a moment. We need to find out what your brother discovered on his land. Whatever it was, it got him killed, and now maybe Simmons too. How do we do that? Blackwell controls the property now. A small, grim smile crossed Abe's face. Not all of it, if your deed is legitimate. And even if it isn't, I know those hills better than most of Blackwell's men. We can visit your brother's land without being seen if you're willing to take the risk. Violet didn't hesitate. When do we leave? Not until the sheriff and his posse are occupied elsewhere, Abe replied. We'll need to be careful. Blackwell will have his men on high alert after Simmons's death. They agreed to meet at the livery stable at noon, giving the sheriff's posse time to complete their investigation at the murder scene. Violet returned to the boarding house to gather what she might need for the journey, including her brother's map and deed. As she packed a small satchel, Mrs. Hawkins appeared in the doorway. You're going out to your brother's land, aren't you? She asked, her voice tinged with worry. Violet nodded. I have to. It's the only way to find out what really happened to Thomas. The older woman sighed. I feared as much. Here, take these. She handed Violet a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Some bread and cheese for the journey, and this. From her pocket, she produced a small revolver. It was my late husband's, not much, but better than nothing if you run into trouble. Violet accepted both gifts gratefully, touched by the woman's kindness. Thank you, Mrs. Hawkins. I'll be careful. See that you are, Mrs. Hawkins replied firmly. And keep an eye on that Calloway fellow, too. He has a reputation, that one. What kind of reputation? Violet asked, her curiosity piqued. Mrs. Hawkins hesitated. There are stories. Some say he used to ride with Blackwell's outfit years ago before something happened between them. Others say he was a bounty hunter who crossed Blackwell by bringing in some men the rancher had hired for. Unsavory work. Whatever the truth, there's bad blood there, deep and old. This new information gave Violet pause. If Abe had history with Blackwell, it could explain his willingness to help her, but it could also mean his motives weren't entirely altruistic. Was he using her quest for justice as a means to settle his own score with the rancher? At noon, Violet made her way to the livery stable, her mind still turning over what Mrs. Hawkins had told her. She found Abe already there, saddling both their horses. He'd added saddlebags to her mount, filled with supplies for the journey. Sheriff's posse is still out investigating, Abe informed her as she approached. They found tracks leading toward the mountains, so they'll be occupied for a while. It's a good time for us to slip away. Violet nodded, watching as he efficiently checked the saddle girth on her horse. Mr. Calloway, she began hesitantly, I heard something about your past that I think we should discuss. Abe's hands stilled momentarily, but he didn't look at her. Let me guess, Mrs. Hawkins told you I used to ride with Blackwell. Among other theories, Violet confirmed. Is it true? Abe finished with the saddle and finally turned to face her. Does it matter? I'm helping you now. It matters if your involvement puts me in more danger, Violet replied firmly. I need to know what I'm walking into. For a long moment, Abe said nothing, his expression unreadable. Then he sighed, leaning against the stable wall. I rode with Blackwell for a time years ago, he admitted, before he became what he is now. We were both just trying to make our way in this territory, but Blackwell's ambitions grew and his methods changed. When he started forcing people off their land, people who had legal right to it, I objected. We had a disagreement. What kind of disagreement? Violet pressed. Abe's jaw tightened. The kind that ends with 2 men dead and me with a price on my head as far as Blackwell's concerned. I left his outfit and the territory for a few years, thought enough time had passed that I could ride through without trouble. He gave a humorless laugh. Guess I was wrong. So this is personal for you, Violet observed. Helping me gives you a chance to strike back at Blackwell. Maybe, Abe acknowledged. Does that change your mind about letting me help you? Violet considered his question carefully. On one hand, Abe's vendetta against Blackwell complicated matters and potentially put her in greater danger. On the other, his knowledge of both Blackwell and the territory was invaluable. No, she finally decided. I still need your help, but no more secrets, Mr. Calloway. From now on, we're honest with each other. Abe nodded, seeming relieved by her decision. Fair enough, And given the circumstances, you might as well call me Abe. Mr. Calloway makes me feel like I'm in trouble with a schoolmarm." Despite the tension of the moment, Violet found herself smiling. "Then I'm Violet. Now, let's go find out what my brother discovered on his land." They led their horses out the back of the livery stable to avoid being seen from the main street, mounting up once they reached the edge of town. Instead of taking the north road directly, Abe led them east along a less traveled trail that would eventually loop around to approach Thomas's property from the rear, away from Blackwell's ranch house. "Your brother's land is mostly in this valley," Abe explained as they rode, referring to the map Violet had brought. "It's good ground with access to water from the mountain streams, valuable for farming but even more valuable for what's beneath it." "What's beneath it?" Violet asked, surprised. "Coal," Abe replied simply. "There are deposits throughout these hills. Blackwell knows it too. He's been buying up every parcel he can get his hands on, looking toward the future when the railroad comes through." Violet's eyes widened. "You think Thomas discovered coal on his property?" "It's possible," Abe conceded. "Would explain Blackwell's eagerness to acquire the land and why he might resort to extreme measures if your brother refused to sell." They rode for hours, taking a circuitous route to avoid being seen by Blackwell's patrols. The sun was beginning to lower in the western sky when Abe finally brought them to a stop on a ridge overlooking a small valley. "That's it," he said, pointing to the land below. "Your brother's property?" Violet took in the view with a mixture of emotions. It was beautiful, a verdant valley nestled between rolling hills, with a clear stream cutting through its heart. Thomas had written about the beauty of his new home, but seeing it firsthand made his loss all the more poignant. "Where was his cabin?" she asked softly. Abe pointed to a small clearing near the stream. "Should be about there, assuming he built where most settlers would." They descended the ridge carefully, alert for any sign of Blackwell's men. As they approached the clearing, Violet could make out the charred remains of a small structure, all that was left of her brother's dream. "It burned," she whispered, dismounting to examine the ruins closer. "Was this reported in the official account of his death?" Abe shook his head, dismounting beside her. "Not that I heard. Sheriff said your brother drowned in the creek during a flash flood, never mentioned a fire." Violet moved carefully through the blackened timbers, searching for anything that might have survived the flames. Most of Thomas's possessions had been reduced to ash, but near what must have been the rear wall, she discovered a small metal box, its contents protected from the worst of the fire. "Abe," she called, excitement in her voice. "Look at this." He joined her as she opened the box, revealing a journal and several folded documents. The journal's edges were singed, but the contents remained readable. Violet opened it with trembling hands, turning to the final entries. "This is dated just 2 days before Thomas supposedly died," she said, reading aloud. "Found evidence of coal deposits on the northeast section of my property today. Significant enough to be worth a small fortune when the railroad comes through. No wonder Blackwell has been so eager to buy me out. Tomorrow I'll ride to Miles City to file an official mineral claim with the land office. Blackwell won't be able to touch it then." She looked up at Abe, her suspicions confirmed. "Thomas discovered coal on his land and was going to file a legal claim that would have prevented Blackwell from getting it. And he never made it to the land office," Abe finished grimly. "Blackwell must have found out somehow and had him killed before he could file the paperwork." Violet continued reading, turning to the final entry. "Simmons came by again today with another offer from Blackwell, double what I paid for the land. When I refused, his tone changed. Said I should be careful around these parts. Accidents happen easily to Easterners. I don't scare easily, but I'm not a fool either. Have hidden samples and survey maps in the old mining shaft on the North Ridge, just in case. If anything happens to me, V will know what to do." "V, that's me," Violet said, her voice catching. "He was leaving evidence for me to find." Abe's expression was grim. "And now we know why Simmons was killed. He must have told Blackwell about your visit to the grave, and Blackwell realized you might discover what your brother had hidden." "We need to find that mining shaft," Violet said urgently, "before Blackwell's men do." "It'll be dark soon," Abe warned, glancing at the setting sun. "Searching for a mine shaft at night is dangerous work. We don't have a choice," Violet insisted. "If Blackwell figures out what we're looking for, he'll tear this place apart to find it first." Abe reluctantly agreed, and they secured their horses in a small copse of trees before making their way toward the north ridge. The fading light made the climb treacherous, but Violet pressed on, driven by the need to find the evidence Thomas had left behind. The old mining shaft wasn't easy to locate. Years of disuse had allowed vegetation to partially conceal its entrance. But as the last light of day gave way to dusk, Abe spotted an unnatural opening in the rocky hillside, partially hidden by overgrown shrubs. "There," he said, pointing to the dark recess. "That looks like it." Violet approached cautiously, Abe close behind. The entrance was narrow, forcing them to duck as they entered. Abe struck a match, illuminating a short tunnel that extended about 20 feet into the hillside before ending in a collapsed section. "This was probably an exploratory shaft from years ago," Abe explained, lighting a small lantern he'd brought in his pack. "Prospectors dug hundreds of these throughout the territory, looking for gold or silver. Most were abandoned when they didn't pan out." They moved carefully into the shaft, the lantern casting eerie shadows against the rough-hewn walls. Near the back, Violet noticed a section of the wall that looked recently disturbed, the rock face scratched where someone had moved stones. "Here," she said, kneeling to examine the spot. "I think something's hidden behind these rocks." Together, they carefully removed several stones, revealing a small cavity in the wall. Inside was a canvas-wrapped package, which Violet withdrew with trembling hands. She unwrapped it to find several coal samples and a carefully drawn survey map with notes in Thomas's handwriting, detailing the extent of the coal deposits on his property. "This is it," she breathed. "Proof of what Thomas found and why Blackwell killed him." As she was studying the map, a sound from outside the shaft made them both freeze, the unmistakable noise of approaching horses. Abe extinguished the lantern immediately. "Blackwell's men," he whispered. "They must have been watching the property after all." They pressed themselves against the wall of the shaft, listening as multiple riders approached and dismounted near the entrance. Violet's heart pounded so loudly she was certain it would give them away. "They've been here," a gruff voice announced from just outside the shaft. "Fresh tracks leading up from the burned cabin. Check the mine," another voice ordered. "Simmons said the James woman was asking questions about her brother, if she found something." Abe drew his revolver, the metal catching what little moonlight filtered into the shaft. "Stay behind me," he whispered to Violet. "When I move, run for the trees where we left the horses. Don't stop no matter what you hear." Before Violet could protest, a beam of lantern light cut into the darkness of the shaft. Two men appeared at the entrance, weapons drawn. "Well, well," one of them said, spotting Abe and Violet. "Look what we found, Calloway and the James woman, just like the boss figured." "Step aside," Abe commanded, his gun steady. "We're leaving with what rightfully belongs to the lady," the men laughed. "Don't think so, Calloway." "Boss wants whatever you found, and he wants the woman too, says she's caused enough trouble." "Your boss is a murderer," Violet declared, her fear giving way to anger. "He killed my brother for this land, and we have proof." "Don't matter what you think you have," the first man replied coldly. "You won't live long enough to tell anyone about it." Abe's finger tightened on the trigger. "Last chance. Step aside." Instead, the second man raised his lantern higher, preparing to signal the others outside. In that moment, Abe fired, his shot striking the lantern and plunging the shaft into darkness. The sound of the gunshot was deafening in the confined space. "Run," Abe shouted, pushing Violet toward the entrance as confused shouts and gunfire erupted around them. Clutching the precious evidence to her chest, Violet stumbled out of the mine shaft into the chaos of the night. More of Blackwell's men were arriving, their lanterns bobbing like fireflies in the darkness. Abe stayed close behind her, firing periodically to keep their pursuers at bay as they made for the trees where their horses waited. Violet's lungs burned as she ran, dodging branches and stones in the near-total darkness. Behind them, Blackwell's men were organizing a pursuit, their angry shouts carrying through the night air. They reached the horses just as a bullet splintered the tree trunk beside Violet's head. Abe helped her mount quickly, then swung into his own saddle. "Head east toward the river," he instructed as they set off. "It's our best chance to lose them." They rode hard through the night, the sound of pursuit gradually fading behind them. The moon provided just enough light to navigate the rough terrain, but it was treacherous going. Twice Violet's horse nearly stumbled on hidden obstacles, and she could feel the animal's sides heaving with exertion. After what felt like hours, they reached the river, a wide, fast-flowing barrier that marked the eastern boundary of Blackwell's influence. Abe led them to a shallow ford, the water reaching only to their horses' knees. On the far bank they finally slowed, allowing their exhausted mounts to catch their breath. Violet's hands were shaking as she secured the precious evidence in her saddlebag. "Will they follow us across the river?" she asked, glancing back at the dark water. Abe shook his head. "Not tonight. They'll wait for daylight, but we need to keep moving. There's a line shack about 5 miles from here where we can rest until morning." The line shack, a crude shelter used by cowboys during roundup season, was little more than 4 walls and a roof. But it offered protection from the elements and, more importantly, concealment from Blackwell's searching men. Abe quickly started a small fire in the stone hearth while Violet tended to the horses. "We should be safe here for a few hours," Abe said as Violet joined him by the fire. "At first light, we'll head for Helena. The territorial governor has an office there. He's no friend of Blackwell's, from what I hear. He might be willing to listen to your story, especially with the evidence we found." Violet nodded, the events of the day catching up with her as exhaustion set in. She took out Thomas's journal and the survey maps, spreading them on the rough plank floor beside the fire. "Thomas knew the risks," she said softly, running her fingers over her brother's handwriting, "but he still stood his ground against Blackwell. He was brave," Abe acknowledged. "Not many would have." Violet looked up at him, studying his face in the firelight. The hard lines were still there, but softened somehow by the dancing shadows. "Why did you help me, really? It can't just be your old grudge against Blackwell." Abe was silent for a long moment, staring into the flames. "When I rode with Blackwell," he finally said, "I did things I ain't proud of, helped him pressure people off their land, though we never killed anyone, not back then, at least." He paused, his expression distant. "There was a woman, a widow with 2 young children. She had a small ranch that Blackwell wanted. We were sent to convince her to sell." "What happened?" Violet asked quietly. She refused. "Stood on her porch with a shotgun and told us her husband had died defending that land during the war, and she'd do the same if necessary." Abe's voice grew rough with emotion. "I couldn't do it. Couldn't threaten a widow defending her children's inheritance. I told Blackwell I was done, that there had to be lines we wouldn't cross." "And that's when you had your disagreement," Abe nodded. "Blackwell sent other men to finish what I wouldn't. They burned her barn as a warning. That night I confronted him, things got heated, and 2 of his men ended up dead. I've been riding away from that night ever since." "What happened to the widow?" Violet asked, dreading the answer. "Don't know," Abe admitted, the regret plain in his voice. "I had to flee the territory with Blackwell's men on my tail. Always wondered, though." They fell silent, the crackling of the fire the only sound in the small cabin. Violet found herself seeing Abe in a new light, not just a hard man with a personal vendetta, but someone who had tried to stand up for what was right, even at great cost to himself. "Thank you for telling me," she said finally. "And thank you for helping me find the truth about Thomas." Abe's eyes met hers across the fire, something unspoken passing between them. "Get some rest," he said softly. "Tomorrow will be another long day." Violet tried to sleep, using her saddle as a pillow, but rest proved elusive. Her mind kept returning to everything she'd learned about Thomas, about Blackwell, about Abe. Outside, the wind had picked up, howling around the corners of the small shack like a mourning woman. She must have dozed eventually, because she woke with a start to find the fire burned down to embers and Abe standing by the single window, peering out into the pre-dawn gloom. "What is it?" she asked, immediately alert. Riders, Abe replied grimly. At least 6 of them coming from the west. They must have found the ford in the dark after all. Violet scrambled to her feet, gathering Thomas's journal and the evidence they'd recovered. How long do we have? Not long, Abe said, moving to check his revolver. They'll be here in minutes. The situation was dire. There was only one door and one window, making the line shack a potential death trap. Even with Abe's skill with a gun, they couldn't hope to hold off 6 armed men for long. Is there another way out? Violet asked urgently. Abe shook his head. Not that I can see. But there's a ridge behind the shack. If we can reach it, we might be able to lose them in the rocks. They quickly saddled the horses, which they'd brought inside the shack for warmth, and prepared to make a run for it. Abe peered out the window again, his expression tightening. They're spreading out, he reported. Trying to surround us, we need to go now while there's still a gap to the south. He turned to Violet, his face grave in the dim light. I'll go out first, draw their fire. When they focus on me, you ride hard for the ridge, don't look back. I'm not leaving you behind, Violet protested. This isn't a debate, Abe replied firmly. You have the evidence, you need to get it to Helena. Before Violet could argue further, the sound of a voice calling from outside silenced them both. Calloway, we know you're in there. Send out the woman and the documents, and maybe you walk away from this. That's not going to happen, Abe shouted back. Ride away now, and I won't have to kill any more of Blackwell's men. A harsh laugh answered him. Big talk from a man trapped like a rat. You've got 1 minute to reconsider before we burn that shack down around your ears. Abe turned to Violet, his decision made. When you hear gunfire, go out the back. Stay low, use the horses for cover until you reach the trees, then ride like hell for Helena. Abe, no, Violet began, but he cut her off. Please, Violet, your brother deserves justice. Make sure he gets it. The intensity in his eyes silenced her protests. In that moment, something shifted between them, the acknowledgement of feelings that had been building since they'd first met in the saloon. Without thinking, Violet stepped forward and kissed him. A brief but fierce meeting of lips that conveyed everything words couldn't. When she pulled back, Abe looked momentarily stunned, then a small smile touched his lips. Well, he said softly, that's something worth fighting for. Before she could respond, a flaming arrow struck the roof of the shack, the dry wood catching fire immediately. More arrows followed, their fiery trails arcing through the early morning darkness. Go, Abe urged, positioning himself by the door with his revolver ready. Now, Violet, heart pounding, Violet mounted her horse and prepared to flee. As Abe kicked open the door and began firing at their attackers, she urged her horse toward the back of the shack, where the wall had partially collapsed from years of neglect. Gunfire erupted around her as she broke into the open, keeping low in the saddle as Abe had instructed. She heard shouts and more shots behind her, but forced herself not to look back, focusing instead on the ridge and the promise of safety beyond it. As she reached the tree line, a bullet whizzed past her ear, far too close for comfort. Her horse, panicked by the noise and the smell of smoke, needed little encouragement to run at full speed toward the rocky ridge ahead. Only when she had crested the ridge and descended into the valley beyond did Violet dare to stop and look back. The lined shack was fully engulfed in flames now, a beacon of destruction in the growing light of dawn. Of Abe and their pursuers, there was no sign. Tears stung Violet's eyes as she faced an impossible choice: continue to Helena with the evidence as Abe had asked, or return to help the man who had risked everything to help her find the truth about her brother. In her heart, she knew what Thomas would have wanted her to do. With a silent prayer for Abe's safety, she turned her horse eastward and continued toward Helena, the precious evidence secure in her saddlebag and the memory of Abe's kiss still warm on her lips. The journey to Helena was grueling. Violet pushed herself and her horse to the limits of endurance, stopping only when absolutely necessary for brief rest and water. She avoided main trails and settlements, fearful that Blackwell's influence might extend even this far east. By the time the territorial capital came into view, both Violet and her mount were near collapse from exhaustion. The city was larger than Miles City, with proper buildings of stone and brick lining the main streets. The territorial governor's office was housed in an imposing structure at the center of town, the flag of the United States fluttering above its entrance. Violet approached with trepidation, acutely aware of her disheveled appearance after days on the trail. The clerk at the front desk regarded her with suspicion when she requested an audience with Governor Potts. "The governor sees visitors by appointment only, miss," he informed her primly, "and he's fully booked for the next 3 days. Please," Violet pleaded, "it's a matter of life and death." "I have evidence of murder and land fraud in Miles City, evidence that implicates Lucas Blackwell." At the mention of Blackwell's name, the clerk's expression changed subtly. "Wait here," he said, rising from his desk. "I'll see if the governor can spare a few minutes." To Violet's surprise and relief, she was shown into the governor's office less than 10 minutes later. Benjamin Potts was a distinguished-looking man with a neatly trimmed beard and intelligent eyes. He rose as she entered, gesturing to a chair before his desk. "Miss James, I understand you have serious allegations to make against Mr. Blackwell," he said without preamble. "I should inform you that such claims require substantial evidence." "I have evidence, Governor," Violet replied, removing the journal and survey maps from her satchel. "My brother, Thomas James, discovered coal deposits on land he legally purchased near Miles City. When he refused to sell to Blackwell, he was murdered and his death disguised as an accident." The governor's expression remained neutral as he examined the documents Violet presented. He studied the survey maps with particular attention, occasionally nodding to himself. "These coal deposits," he said finally, "if they're as extensive as your brother's surveys suggest, they could be quite valuable once the Northern Pacific Railroad completes its line through the territory." "Valuable enough to kill for?" Violet asked pointedly. Governor Potts sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Miss James, I've had concerns about Lucas Blackwell's methods for some time. There have been rumors, but without concrete evidence or witnesses willing to testify, my hands have been tied." "I'm willing to testify," Violet declared. "And I have my brother's journal detailing Blackwell's attempts to pressure him into selling. There's also a man named Abe Calloway who can corroborate parts of my story if—" She faltered, the worry she'd been suppressing rushing back. "If he's still alive," the governor raised an eyebrow. "Calloway, the name is familiar." "He helped me discover the truth about my brother," Violet explained. "But Blackwell's men caught up with us. Abe stayed behind so I could escape with the evidence." Governor Potts was silent for a long moment, studying Violet's face. "What you're proposing would not be easy, Miss James. Blackwell has considerable influence in the territory, including friends in the Legislative Assembly. Building a case against him would require more than just these documents." "What more do you need?" Violet asked, her frustration evident. "Witnesses. Testimony from others who have been victimized by Blackwell, perhaps evidence of his involvement in other illegal activities." The governor stood, moving to the window that overlooked the busy street below. "I can send a U.S. Marshal to investigate your brother's death and these coal deposits, but it will take time to build a proper case." "Time is something we may not have," Violet replied urgently. "Blackwell knows I have this evidence. He won't stop until he's silenced me too." The governor turned back to face her, his expression grave. "Then perhaps we need to move more quickly than the usual channels allow. I have a trusted marshal in town now, a man named Robert Hayes. He's been investigating other matters involving Blackwell's operations." "With your evidence added to what he's already gathered." Hope flared in Violet's heart. "You'll help then?" "Justice must be served," Governor Potts stated firmly. "And if what you've shown me is accurate, a great injustice has been committed against your brother and perhaps many others." He rang a bell on his desk, and the clerk appeared promptly. "Send a telegraph to Sheriff Davies in Miles City," the governor instructed. "Inform him that U.S. Marshal Hayes will be arriving within the week to investigate matters pertaining to the death of Thomas James. Also, arrange accommodations for Miss James at the International Hotel at my expense. She will be remaining in Helena for the foreseeable future." The clerk nodded and departed to carry out his instructions. The governor turned back to Violet with a more compassionate expression. "You've been through an ordeal, Miss James. Rest today. Tomorrow, you'll meet with Marshal Hayes and provide him with all the details of your brother's death and what you've uncovered about Blackwell." Violet felt a wave of relief wash over her, tempered only by her concern for Abe. "Thank you, Governor. There's just one more thing, Abe Calloway. Is there any way to find out what happened to him?" "I'll include instructions for the marshal to make inquiries about Mr. Calloway's whereabouts," the governor promised. "Though I must warn you if he was confronted by Blackwell's men." He didn't need to finish the thought. Violet was all too aware of the likely outcome of such a confrontation, but something in her refused to believe Abe was gone. He was too stubborn, too resilient to die so easily. The International Hotel was the finest establishment Violet had ever stayed in, with actual gaslights in the rooms and hot running water. After days on the trail, the simple luxury of a bath and clean clothes felt almost decadent. But despite her physical comfort, sleep remained elusive, her mind filled with images of Abe facing down Blackwell's men alone. The next morning, she met with Marshal Hayes, a stern-faced man with a reputation for incorruptibility. He listened intently as Violet recounted everything that had happened since her arrival in Miles City, taking meticulous notes and occasionally asking for clarification. "This is consistent with other reports we've received about Blackwell's operations," Hayes confirmed when she had finished. "We've been building a case against him for some time, but your brother's journal and these survey maps may be the evidence we need to finally take action." "How soon can you move against Blackwell?" Violet asked. "I'll leave for Miles City tomorrow," Hayes replied. "With luck, I can gather the remaining evidence I need within a week or two, then we'll request warrants for Blackwell and his key men." "And Abe Calloway," Violet pressed. "Will you look for him?" Something like sympathy crossed the marshal's weathered face. "I'll make inquiries, Miss James. But you should prepare yourself for the possibility that Calloway didn't survive the encounter at the Line Shack." Violet refused to accept that possibility. "He's alive," she insisted. "I know it." The days that followed were an exercise in patience and restraint. Violet longed to return to Miles City to search for Abe herself, but both the governor and Marshal Hayes insisted she remain in Helena where her safety could be guaranteed. Instead, she channeled her energy into helping build the case against Blackwell, providing detailed statements about everything she had witnessed and learned. A week after Marshal Hayes departed for Miles City, a telegraph arrived for Violet at the hotel. Her hands trembled as she opened it, hoping for news of Abe. The message was brief but electrifying. "Calloway alive, stop in custody, Miles City, stop Blackwell charged murder, Thomas James, stop return when ready, stop Hayes alive." The word sang through Violet's veins like wildfire. Abe was alive. Questions tumbled through her mind. Was he injured? Why was he in custody? But those concerns were overshadowed by the sheer relief of knowing he had survived. She made arrangements to return to Miles City immediately, traveling with a cavalry escort provided by Governor Potts to ensure her safety. The journey seemed to take an eternity, though in reality it was only 3 days of hard riding. Miles City looked different to Violet as she rode down its main street, less intimidating, somehow, now that she knew Blackwell's grip on the town had been broken. People watched curiously as she passed, word of her role in Blackwell's downfall having spread quickly through the small community. She went directly to the sheriff's office, her heart pounding as she dismounted. Inside, she found Sheriff Davies looking distinctly uncomfortable behind his desk, while Marshal Hayes sorted through a stack of documents nearby. "Miss James," Hayes greeted her, looking up from his work. "I'm glad you received my telegraph. Your evidence proved invaluable. Blackwell is in custody, along with several of his men, charged with your brother's murder and numerous other crimes." "Thank you, Marshal," Violet replied, her eyes scanning the small office. "But the telegraph mentioned Abe Calloway. Where is he?" "In the cell block," Hayes replied, nodding toward a door at the rear of the office. He's recovering from his wounds but should be well enough for visitors now. Wounds, and why is he in a cell? Violet demanded, her relief giving way to confusion and anger. He helped bring Blackwell to justice. Calloway has his own charges to answer for, Sheriff Davies interjected. Old warrants from years back. Marshal Hayes shot the sheriff a stern look before addressing Violet. It's complicated, Miss James. Calloway did indeed help expose Blackwell's crimes at great personal risk, but there are outstanding matters that need resolution before he can be released. What matters? Violet pressed. That's between the law and Calloway, Sheriff Davies replied stiffly. I'd like to see him, Violet said, her tone making it clear this wasn't a request. Hayes nodded to the sheriff, who reluctantly produced a ring of keys and led Violet to the door at the back of the office. Beyond it was a short hallway with 3 cells, only one of which was occupied. Abe sat on a narrow cot, his right arm in a sling and a bandage visible beneath his partially unbuttoned shirt. He looked up as they approached, his expression transforming from guarded to stunned when he saw Violet. 10 minutes, Sheriff Davies grunted, unlocking the cell door to admit Violet before retreating to the front office. For a moment after the sheriff left, neither Violet nor Abe spoke. They simply looked at each other, drinking in the sight like parched travelers finding an oasis in the desert. You're alive, Violet finally whispered, moving to sit beside him on the cot. When I last saw you. It was a near thing, Abe admitted, his voice rough with emotion. Took a bullet in the shoulder and another that grazed my side. Might have been the end of me if the marshal and his deputies hadn't arrived when they did. The marshal? Violet asked, confused, but I only spoke to Governor Potts after I reached Helena. How did Hayes know to come to the line shack? He was already tracking Blackwell's men, Abe explained. Apparently they've been watching him for months, building a case. When the shooting started, Hayes and his deputies were close enough to hear it. They drove off what was left of Blackwell's men and found me half dead in the burning shack. Violet reached out hesitantly, her fingers brushing the bandage visible beneath his shirt. I wanted to go back for you, she said softly, but I knew you'd want me to get the evidence to safety first. You did right, Abe assured her. Your brother got his justice because of your courage. Violet's hand moved from his bandage to his face, gently turning it so their eyes met. And now you're in jail. Why? What are these charges the sheriff mentioned? Abe sighed, leaning slightly into her touch. Remember that disagreement with Blackwell I told you about? The one that ended with 2 of his men dead. Turns out there's still a warrant for that, even though it was self-defense. Can't the governor pardon you, given what you've done to help expose Blackwell? Marshal Hayes is working on something like that, Abe replied. But law moves slow out here, even when it's working properly. Violet's determination crystallized into resolve. Then I'll speak to the governor myself. You risked everything to help me find the truth about Thomas. I won't let you rot in jail for it. A small smile touched Abe's lips. You're something else, Violet James. Most people would have given up long before now. I'm not most people, she replied, returning his smile. And neither are you, Abe Calloway. Their eyes held for a long moment, the connection between them deepening with each passing second. Slowly, deliberately, Violet leaned forward and kissed him, not the desperate, fleeting kiss they'd shared in the line shack, but something softer, a promise of possibilities to come. When they parted, Abe's good hand had found its way to her waist, holding her close. I've been thinking, he said quietly, if I get out of here, well, your brother's land will need someone to work it. The coal deposits alone are worth a fortune, but the rest of it's good ranch land too. Violet's heart quickened at his words. Are you offering to be my ranch manager, Mr. Calloway? I'm offering a lot more than that, Abe replied, his eyes never leaving hers. If you'll have me. Before Violet could respond, Sheriff Davies appeared at the cell door. Time's up, he announced brusquely. I'll be back, Violet promised Abe, rising reluctantly from the cot, and I'll speak to the governor about your situation today. I'll be here, Abe replied with a wry smile, not going anywhere for a while. True to her word, Violet sent a detailed telegraph to Governor Potts that same day, explaining Abe's crucial role in exposing Blackwell's crimes and requesting his intervention in the matter of the outstanding warrants. She also visited Marshal Hayes, who confirmed he was already advocating for leniency in Abe's case. Calloway's testimony will be vital in ensuring Blackwell and his men are convicted, Hayes explained. And his actions in helping you uncover the truth about your brother's murder certainly speak in his favor. I believe the governor will be receptive to our recommendations. 3 days later, a response arrived from Helena. Governor Potts had reviewed the case and, in light of Abe's assistance in bringing Blackwell to justice, had commuted his sentence to time served. Abe would be released immediately, with the condition that he testify at Blackwell's trial. Violet was waiting outside the sheriff's office when Abe emerged, free for the first time in weeks. He looked thinner than she remembered, his face more angular, but his eyes lit up when he saw her. "You did it," he said in wonder as he descended the steps to meet her. "You actually convinced the governor." "We did it," Violet corrected him. "And now we have decisions to make about the future." They walked slowly down the main street of Miles City, aware of the curious glances from townspeople but focused entirely on each other and the conversation at hand. "I meant what I said in that cell," Abe told her. "Your brother's land has potential not just the coal but for ranching too. With the right investment and hard work, it could be something special." "Our land," Violet corrected softly, "if you were serious about your offer." Abe stopped walking, turning to face her fully. "I am, but it's a big decision, Violet. I'm not an easy man to. Well, I've been on my own a long time, got habits that might be hard to break." "I'm not asking you to break anything," Violet replied, taking his hands in hers. "Just to build something new, with me." For a moment, Abe seemed at a loss for words, his usual confidence replaced by something more vulnerable. "You should know," he finally said, "I don't believe in much, never have. Not God, not heaven, not any kind of reward waiting for men like me when this life is done." Violet smiled, understanding the deeper confession beneath his words. "Then we'll have to make our heaven right here," she said simply. "Together." The trial of Lucas Blackwell was the biggest event Miles City had seen in years. People came from as far as Helena to witness the proceedings, which lasted for 2 full weeks as witness after witness testified to Blackwell's crimes, not just the murder of Thomas James, but years of intimidation, fraud, and violence used to build his empire. Abe's testimony was perhaps the most damaging, detailing his time in Blackwell's employment and the progressive escalation of illegal activities he had witnessed. When Blackwell's lawyer attempted to discredit him by bringing up his own violent past, Abe acknowledged his mistakes without excuses, his honesty resonating with the jury. Violet testified about finding her brother's journal and the evidence of coal deposits, as well as the button discovered by his grave that contradicted Blackwell's story about where Thomas had died. Her composure and determination in the face of aggressive questioning from the defense won the sympathy of everyone in the courtroom. In the end, the verdict was unanimous: guilty on all counts. Lucas Blackwell was sentenced to hang for the murder of Thomas James, while his key men received lengthy prison terms for their roles in his criminal enterprise. As Blackwell was led away in chains, he paused to glare at Abe and Violet. "This changes nothing," he spat. "You'll never be safe in this territory. I have friends who..." "That's enough," the marshal interrupted, pushing Blackwell forward. "Your threats don't carry much weight anymore." Outside the courthouse, Abe and Violet found themselves surrounded by townspeople offering congratulations and, in some cases, apologies for not standing against Blackwell sooner. "What happens now?" Mrs. Hawkins asked as the crowd began to disperse. "Will you stay in Miles City or return east?" Violet exchanged a glance with Abe, their decision already made. "We're staying," she announced. "We're going to rebuild on my brother's land, our land now, make it into something Thomas would have been proud of." The transformation of the James Calloway Ranch, as it came to be known, didn't happen overnight. The first months were hard, with Abe and Violet living in a hastily constructed cabin while they worked to clear the charred remains of Thomas's original home and plan for something more permanent. The coal deposits proved to be exactly as valuable as Thomas had estimated. With the Northern Pacific Railroad now actively laying track through the territory, Violet and Abe were able to negotiate a favorable contract for mining rights that provided the capital they needed to develop the rest of the property. By the spring of 1880, they had completed a proper ranch house, built near the site of Thomas's original cabin, but larger and more solidly constructed. A small herd of cattle grazed on the western pastures, while the eastern section of the property was dedicated to crops that thrived in Montana's short growing season. On a warm evening in June, Abe and Violet sat on the porch of their new home, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. Violet's hand rested on her slightly rounded belly, evidence of the child that would arrive before winter. "Thomas would have loved this," she said softly, looking out over the flourishing land. "Seeing his dream come to life, he sees it," Abe replied, surprising her. When she turned to him with a questioning look, he smiled. "Maybe there's no heaven like the preachers talk about, but if there is, I reckon it might feel something like this. Land of your own, someone to share it with, a future worth building." Violet leaned against him, her head finding its familiar place on his shoulder. "For a man who doesn't believe in heaven, you've become quite the poet, Mr. Calloway." Abe chuckled, wrapping his arm around her. "Don't tell anyone. I've got a reputation to maintain." As darkness fell, they remained on the porch, talking softly about their plans for the ranch, the baby, the future they were building together. Neither felt the need to go inside until the first stars appeared, twinkling like distant promises in the vast Montana sky. Later, as they lay by the fire in their bedroom, Violet nestled in the protective circle of Abe's arms. She reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. She had come to Montana seeking justice for her brother, never expecting to find love in the process, especially not with a hard-eyed cowboy who claimed to believe in nothing but his own gun. Yet here they were, building a life together on land that had once been soaked with her brother's blood, transforming tragedy into hope with each passing day. "What are you thinking about?" Abe murmured, his breath warm against her hair. "About how sometimes the things we're not looking for turn out to be exactly what we need," Violet replied, turning in his arms to face him. "I came here for Thomas, but I found you. And I was just passing through," Abe said, his fingers gently tracing the curve of her face. "Never planning to stay anywhere for long." Then a stubborn woman walked into a saloon asking questions nobody wanted to answer. Violet smiled, remembering that first encounter. "You could have minded your own business. Why did you help me?" Abe was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "Because you weren't afraid," he finally said. "Everyone else in that town was living in Blackwell's shadow, but you walked right up to it and demanded answers. That kind of courage, it's rare. So is the kind that faces down 6 armed men to help a woman you barely knew," Violet countered, her hand resting over his heart, feeling its steady beat beneath her palm. "Worth it," Abe said simply, covering her hand with his own. "Every bullet, every day in that cell. I'd do it all again to end up right here." In the dancing firelight, Violet saw the truth of his words reflected in his eyes that had once been cold and distant, but now held a warmth reserved only for her. The harsh cowboy who had ridden into Miles City that autumn day, bleeding and bitter, had found something he never expected. A home, a future, a love worth fighting for. As they drifted toward sleep in each other's arms, Violet thought she understood what Abe had meant earlier. Perhaps heaven wasn't some distant reward waiting after death, but something that could be found right here in moments of connection, in shared dreams, in the simple miracle of 2 wounded souls finding healing in each other's embrace. The harsh cowboy who didn't believe in heaven had found it after all, not in some distant paradise, but in her arms beside the fire.